But India is the only country in the world which calls itself a democracy among all the 192 countries on planet Earth, in which news and current affairs on the radio is still a monopoly of the government. Ashish here, who's helped set up so many community radio stations, will tell you how anomalous a situation is, that we have large numbers of private owners of newspapers and television channels and websites and telecom channels and whatnot. But news on radio is still a monopoly of the government of India, All India Radio. But television is also another very interesting example. People forget that a little over 2 decades ago, there used to be one broadcaster in this country, your favorite Doordarshan. And today we are the only country in the world where the government of India has given permission to close to 800 television channels to uplink and downlink from this country. And what's interesting is over 300 of these television channels call themselves news and current affairs channels. It's a separate matter that some of you may consider what is put out on these television channels is neither newsy nor current. So when you see two snakes getting married and it's a live breaking news exclusive, you'll wonder what's going on. Ghost sighted over the Taj Mahal, exclusive breaking news. That's because the way news has been defined by the government of India. It's pretty anomalous, but it exists. Nobody really knows that the number of internet websites that exist to which Indians go to. But when you look at people looking for reliable information, quote unquote, they still tend to go to the websites of these established media organizations, television channels, as well as print organizations. But we are moving to a new age and era. And today we live in this brave new world of the telecom revolution. When India became politically independent, there was one telephone for every 10,000 Indians. Those were the days you had to dial numbers. You know, today's generation punches numbers. Maybe you've seen a dial once in your life. In the museum you can find it. A former telecom minister, you told another member of parliament, you're not happy with that gadget on your desk? Give it back. There are hundreds of thousands of people waiting for that. The telephone was a luxury those days. Prospective father-in-laws would tell their prospective son-in-law, have you applied for a phone? By the time your son goes to school, you might get one. Mera piya kare telephone. Mera piya gaye Rangoon, wahan se kare telephone. Who could have imagined where we are today? 50 years after India became politically independent, there was still one phone for every 1,000 Indians. And I'm talking about 1997. Today, ladies and gentlemen, you are happy to note that in the city that you live in, there are more mobile phones than human beings. It's not I that says so, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. And more of the younger generation are going to access news on that mobile handset. The mass media in India and across the world are consolidating and converging. Creators of content are coming closer to distributors and disseminators. And the dividing line between broadcasting and telecommunications is getting increasingly blurred. And while these phenomena, to some extent, are inevitable and inexorable, it's also true that they do restrict choice. These phenomena do restrict diversity of content. So the technological advantages of these integration of these processes has another side to it. Let me give you a few examples to illustrate a point. When you look at consolidation, and we are seeing a lot of that consolidation happening now because of the Great Recession, the likes of which has not been seen since the time Orson Welles made Citizen Kane. In India, we don't like the R word, so we say economic slowdown. So the fact of the matter is, advertising expenditure is not going up very fast. And that has a direct impact on the media, because the media and media organizations, especially the most successful ones, a huge proportion of their total income comes from advertising. I mean, a company like Bennett Coleman Company Limited, I would say about 90% of the total income of that company would come from advertising. In other words, the newspaper that you bought for 2 or 3 rupees, if there was no advertising in it and the manufacturer or the producer of that newspaper passed on all costs to you, so instead of 2 or 3 rupees, you would have to pay 20 or 30 rupees for that same newspaper. But what you're seeing today are different kinds of mergers and amalgamations taking place. The first is what you might describe as a horizontal kind of a merger. That means erstwhile competitors become collaborators. Example, the Dainik Jagran recently bought up another Hindi daily called Nai Dunia, published from Indore. Then you have other forms of consolidation which could be called vertical forms of consolidation. That means the producers of content and the distributors of content have come together, and this is notable particularly in television. Over the years, for instance, Star, the Star Group, satellite television Asia region, controlled by the one and only Rupert Murdoch, has a huge share in Hathway, the distributors. Sun in Tamil Nadu controls Sumangali. Z controls Dish. So this form of vertical consolidation has existed and continues to exist, even when there are clear conflicts of interest. And that's because in India we do not have what are called restrictions on cross-media ownership, which exist, interestingly, in some of the more, in countries like the United States, in countries like Australia, in countries like UK, Germany, and so on and so forth, which basically there are legal restrictions on whether the same media organization or group can control or dominate markets cutting across different media. But what's very, very interesting is what we call, what you might describe as diagonal forms of consolidation, which is why the dividing line between broadcasting and telecommunications is getting blurred. Who is India's biggest media baron today? Answer the richest man in India, Mukesh Ambani. How come? You knew he was in oil and gas, he was in petrochemicals, he was in textiles. How come? Because he's bailed out 2 corporate groups which were in media. One is my former employer, Mr. Raghav Bahl, who controls a Network 18 group, which includes CNBC, Viacom, I mean, CNN, IBN, etc., etc., etc. And Mr. Ramoji Rao of the Inadu group. And you can get all the details, but this conglomerate is India's biggest conglomerate, media conglomerate. It's bigger than Star, it's bigger than Times of India Group. Now, what's very interesting, and I'll go into this in slightly greater detail later, is how and why this is happening. Because this is not an isolated phenomenon. And it's not just Mukesh Ambani who has emerged as the big guy. I'll just read out a little sentence from what Mr. Raghav Bahl wrote when he took this. He says that this is, he compared it like a cricket match. And he said the best cricket matches are where the decision is taken in the final innings in a test match. And that's what's happening. He says first they had set up something on their own, then they fought with their competitors, finally they've become big. And the amounts involved are in the region of thousands of crores. The deal is worth 2,600 crores, 2,600 crore. And what's particularly interesting is the company that is involved in this conglomeration. It's very paradoxically and ironically called the Independent Media Trust. But as I was saying earlier, Mr. Mukesh Ambani is not alone. Mr. Kumaramangalam Birla, who heads the Aditya Birla Group, has invested an amount varying between, some people say 600 crore, some people say 700 crore, nobody has an official figure, in buying a major stake in the Living Media Group, which owns TV Today, which includes Aaj Tak, one of the most popular Hindi television channels, India Today. They've got dozens and dozens of publications, including they have licensed periodicals like Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, Men's Health, Harper's Bazaar, Forbes, Harvard Business Review, etc., etc., etc. They also have the headlines today. I'm supposed to appear on the channel later this evening. Now, why would Mr. Birla and Mr. Ambani act as a white knight? Why would they bail out these three media organizations where obviously they needed their cash? They were strapped, debt strapped, they needed the money, they needed the white knight. The answer is that Reliance Industries Limited, headed by Mr. Mukesh Ambani, is setting up India's biggest broadband wireless access network. Mr. Birla heads a company which has a brand name of a mobile telecom service called Idea, which happens to be one of the top 3 mobile telecom providers in this country. And they're not alone. They're not alone. So we have seen others also who will be getting into this area. So we are seeing this kind of a diagonal convergence and a consolidation taking place. But there are other examples of business people who were not a part of the media, who are almost becoming media barons. Example, Mr. Abhay Oswal happens to be a major shareholder in NDTV. Mr. Abhay Oswal had a fertilizer company, and that particular fertilizer company is now been sold to a cooperative company, and he has now become a major shareholder in the NDTV group. And purely incidentally, casting no aspersions on anybody, Mr. Abhay Oswal's daughter, Shalu, happens to be married to Naveen Jindal, who is a member of parliament belonging to the Indian National Congress. No aspersions. I am merely stating it as a matter of fact. Closer home, you know about Mr. T. Venkatram Reddy and his rather tenuous association with Mr. Kishore Biani of the Future Group. Mr. T. Venkatram Reddy, according to the Mint newspaper, published by HT Media, which competes with that publication, the Deccan Chronicle, Asian Age Group, according to the Mint newspaper, is going through the worst crisis any newspaper group ever has gone through in India. Maybe it's a little exaggerated, but many attribute Mr. T. Venkatram Reddy's problems. He's also facing allegations of forgery and fraud. Was that from the media, Mr. Venkatram Reddy diversified into various other areas, including race horses, vintage cars, retailing books to the